Hello, I'm David Breeden. I'm the senior minister at First Unitarian Society of Minneapolis. We are a historically humanist congregation, and this is Coffee and Wisdom. This week, we've been looking at the objective subjective split and just what that might mean in terms of how we think, how we act, religion, politics, etc. And we're asking the question, is it possible to have an objective point of view? How do we know when we see in a way that sees what is there? Of course, there's always the question of, is there a there? Is there such a thing as an objectivity? I think this little cartoon kind of underlines the fact that we can see the same thing in different ways. So, where do we find reality when we're talking about that? Certainly in a social sense. Yesterday, I introduced the idea that it comes from a 1964 Harper's Magazine article by Richard Hofstadter, a famous American historian, called The Paranoid Style in American Politics. He calls the paranoid style the sense of heated exaggeration, suspiciousness, and conspiratorial fantasy, he says. And he also points out a very interesting thing. And again, this comes from 1964, but we do need to think of it, I think, as a way that's continuing. The entire right-wing movement of our time is a parade of experts, study groups, monographs, footnotes, and bibliographies. One of the more famous ones being Robert Welch, the founder of the John Birch Society. So Hofstadter says that there are three consistent elements in U.S. paranoid style. The first is that capitalism is being undermined. The second, top government officials are complicit in that plot. And third, the whole apparatus of education, religion, the press, and the mass media is engaged in a common effort to paralyze the resistance of loyal Americans. Well, yeah, you can read that into our present circumstance, but Hofstadter is going to argue that that goes way back. Another book on this that you can read, it came out in 2017. It was being written during the 2016 presidential election, called Fantasyland, How America Went Haywire, a 500-year history, from Kurt Anderson, a novelist and an essayist. Again, looking at how did American politics get to the place it is today. Quote from the book: wallowing in nostalgia for a lost golden age, that was the subject last week, those of you who are along for the ride, ruined by meddling liberal outsiders from Washington and New York, previously a white Southern habit became more and more of a white American habit. And so the Republican Southern strategy could be nationalized as well. Those of you who know the Southern strategy, it was a Richard Nixon era election idea to dog whistle racism into American politics to make the South a solid Republican voting bloc, which worked. And for some reason, my little slideshow is rebooting here for a moment, but we will get it. So the idea here is that this has spread out across the American spectrum. Very much it used to be, or it was at one time, something that was very isolated to what was at one time an American thing, but then became a Southern thing that became an American thing. Sorry, have to get back on my slides here. I got a reboot there. Okay, well, going back, some of you that if you remember Ronald Reagan, this is from the book again. When he first ran for president, Ronald Reagan popularized the term welfare queen, a powerful caricature based on a single criminal case that exaggerated the pervasiveness of welfare fraud and spread the fiction that Black people were the main recipients of government benefits. Then he goes on to say in Vietnam, the United States had also also just lost a war, which gave non-Southerners a strong dose of what we talked about last week, lost cause bitterness for the first time. Again, Reagan used this, it was one of his favorite catchphrases about the welfare queen. There was a woman called the welfare queen who did live in the 1970s, but she did a lot more than collect welfare illegally. She was also a con artist, a kidnapper, and perhaps a murderer, but she certainly wasn't just a person who was trying to take advantage of the welfare system. Again, back to Fantasyland. Since the turn of the 20th century, American fundamentalists had reveled in their sense of persecution by an infidel elite. But in the 1960s, the atheist tyranny became official. In 1962 and 63, the Supreme Court decided in two cases, with only one dissenter in each instance, that it was unconstitutional for public schools to conduct organized prayer or Bible readings. And in 1968, the court finally ruled unanimously that states could not ban the teaching of evolution. And Anderson, anyway, is really seeing this as the breaking point, the point at which the American right, and especially bolstered by right-wing religion, becomes a dominant force in American politics. And then one more little quote from him. In the 1970s, not long before he died, the sci-fi writer Philip Dick, you know, the Matrix guy, right, moved into an apartment in Orange County a few miles from Disneyland, and irony not lost on him. There he wrote a perfect summary of his dread about the transformation of American society and culture as the real and unreal become indistinguishable. And you can see how that feeds into a movie like The Matrix. We have, quote, we have fiction mimicking truth and truth mimicking fiction. We have a dangerous overlap, he said, a dangerous blur. And in all probability, it is not deliberate. In fact, that is part of the problem. Again, there's no master conspiracy theory here, thought Dick, but rather this is happening in an organic way that is beginning to overwhelm the American imagination and the American ability to distinguish between fact and fiction. Now, one of the things that Anderson ties in here, and that's why he calls it a 500-year history of fantasy in the U.S., is that it goes way back. The first Great Awakening occurred in the 1730s and 1740s, well before the American Revolution, and many scholars will argue that it created an us ready for information, because suddenly the colonies are tied together by these huge revivals and traveling preachers. But also, as we see here, this person has just fallen down, speaking in tongues and writhing in the Holy Spirit. And also, you will notice, if you look closely at this illustration, there are within the group African Americans. And that was one of the interesting things about the first Great Awakening, is that it included people from all social classes as it began to spread across the then colonies. The most famous sermon to come out of that is Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God, a sermon preached in Enfield, July 8th, 1741, by Jonathan Edwards. That is, if you want to read a fire and brimstone scare people with hell sermon, that's the one. It became kind of the center of the Great Awakening. And it also creates a very paranoid style, a large group of Americans who are very afraid that God is coming back to get them. And of course, the millennial idea in American Christianity had already been there. It's part of Christianity from the very beginning, but it begins with this outpouring of the Holy Spirit to be taken much more seriously. The end is nigh in the 1730s and 1740s, and American Christians begin to have some kind of understanding that there is something larger than just the little colony that they live in. And of course, this becomes part of the propaganda that goes into fomenting the American Revolution. You may remember, if you've read your Declaration of Independence recently, that one of the things that it condemns the king for is the merciless Indian savages that the king is sicking on the good Americans. Here's a very typical kind of illustration from the time. The British inspired savages are scalping, hanging, and killing the good Americans here. And so what can we do but have a revolution? Which, of course, informs a whole series of American ideas about violence and redemptive violence within our culture. Yes, Thomas Jefferson joined the revolution, this one not being the revolution of that time period, of course, but the symbolism that comes out of that, the propaganda that comes out of that time period, very much still part of what we do today. As a matter of fact, the catchphrases from the QAnon groups are just exactly like they were in the lead up to the American Revolution and in the second and third great awakenings that happened in American society. God over everything. And so these are our little catchphrases that occur a lot in QAnon materials. I can't show you the truth. Follow me. Do you believe in coincidences? The game is rigged. Do the research. Part of the plan. The storm is coming. So do the research, goes right back to Mr. Welch and his ideas of McCarthyism and how Eisenhower was actually a communist operative. Do you believe in coincidences? Well, I guess most of us do, but you don't if you're a conspiracy theorist. And so underlining these ideas that have always been part of the paranoid style in American politics from well before the Revolutionary War. Thanks a lot. We'll talk more about the Great Awakening and how American evangelicalism feeds into the paranoid style in American politics tomorrow. Thanks for joining us today. Tonight at 7 p.m. At our Den of Conversation, we will be having Bibles and Beer, a humanist Bible study. And tonight I'll be talking about Paul's apocalypse. And that is something that was not part of the scriptures. It is apocryphal, but it's also very much part of American millennial thinking that gets embedded into Christianity, even though it's actually not part of any dogma or creed. Thanks a lot for listening today. Our theme this month is Beloved Community. Very much appreciate you joining in, and I'll see you again tomorrow. Thank you.